Hello, everybody. We're back again, and we have completed our seven major religions. And the last thing to talk about when it comes to religious observance is secularism. Now, I don't know that we want to use the word religious observance here, and you'll understand why as we go through. But all of this is still related to what we're talking about. It's belief systems, what people think or what they believe. So secularism is defined as a decline in organized religious observance, and it can mean a lot of different things. A lot of times you'll actually hear it used as separation of church and state. So you'll get people that will say that the United States is secular. We obviously have religion in our country and freedom of religion, but the fact that religion and government are separated from each other means that we live in a secular society. And that is the norm around the world today. There are some countries out there that are still run by a religious leader. And so religion literally dominates the government of a country. But that's kind of few and far in between now. And although our leaders around the world and in the United States have their own religious understanding, they are supposed to be making decisions that are for the good of all the people, regardless of what they believe or what religion they are. And so while religion may guide them in some of their decision making, they don't rule based on religious principle or make laws based on religious principles. And that's a gray area, obviously. You certainly have presidents from the start until now that have discussed their morality and their view on certain topics, things like maybe death penalty or gun control. And religion, their religious understanding is part of how they feel on that particular topic. But what they're not doing is saying, well, the Bible says this, so this is what we're going to do. That would be the difference. I mean, I think everybody has their own sets of morals and ethics, and a lot of that is going to be derived from your religion and from your understanding of faith. But it's something different to actually rule the people by a religious book and say, well, the religious law says this, so this is what we're going to do. But if it's a guiding principle, that's just life. We all have guiding principles that come from different areas, and if one of them comes from religion, then so be it. So anyway, there's your kind of understanding of secularism as it relates to church and state. That would be the third bullet point here. So we do live in a secular society because we allow religious freedom, but that doesn't mean that everybody in the country is atheist or something like that. What it simply means is we separate out our government from our religion. Another way to understand, I know I'm bouncing around here, but if we go up a PowerPoint or up a bullet point, sorry, to number two here, indifference or rejection of organized religious affiliations and ideas. And the idea here is that for some people, they're secular. That's in a way that's not atheist. It's just that they don't really have religion as a part of their life. It doesn't impact their decision making. And they don't pray, they don't go to church or temple or whatever it may be. They just go about their lives without a huge religious influence in their life. And it means that they just kind of do what they do based on their own morals or values or those of society or of their family and their community. And it's not religion that gives them those kinds of things. So that would also be considered secular. So again, you kind of have secularism in general is a decline in organized religious observance. For an individual, it could mean that they are indifferent or generally just kind of reject organized religion. Again, it doesn't mean they're atheists. They may still be themselves spiritual or religious in nature. It's just they don't align themselves to any particular organization. Um, so secular Christian is a term that you hear now where people will say, well, I believe in Jesus and I believe in God, but I don't really believe in any particular version of it. I'm not Presbyterian or Baptist or Catholic or whatever it is. I just I just believe that that's true, and that's it. That would be kind of a secular Christian, where yes, you do still follow Christianity, but you're not involved with any particular affiliation of it, and therefore you're kind of secular Christian. So the word secular can be used in conjunction with other words to kind of identify what you think or what you believe. Okay, in the last bullet point, it says down there that this has been on the rise since the European Renaissance. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And it's definitely accelerated over the last 100 years. The short version of this, I mean, we could get into all the details, and we will to an extent over the next couple of slides. But religion had a stronghold over Europe. I mean, we're focusing on Western religion at the moment here. And religion had a real grasp on European society through what we call the Dark Ages. Christianity kind of took over in the 400s and 500s as the Roman Empire crumbled, and you had Christianity become for 1,000 years the the government of the people. You had nobles and you had kings and queens and rulers and all the different parts of Europe, but they all ruled by the hand of God. So that was the old, you get your power from God understanding. And so they weren't religious leaders per se, but they were handpicked by God to rule. And so you just had this kind of religious control over people. And most people were uneducated. Most people couldn't even write their name. It's predicted that 98% of the population of Europe in the height of the Dark Ages in the 1300s, they were signing their names with an X because they didn't even know how to write their name out. And based on their life and their lifestyle, there was no need for that. Education, for you to work in the fields, you didn't need to be educated. And so life was tough. You worked in the field 6 days a week, 10 hours a day or 12 hours a day, and then you got to rest on Sunday and go to church. And so that was the best part of your week when you didn't have to work and you could dedicate a day to God. And that was your life. It was a difficult existence, and as you guys know, we talked about it during population. Life expectancy was very low for the vast majority of the population. If you lived to 40 in that day and age, you had lived a fairly long life. So, of course, your nobility that didn't work those hard hours in the field, they lived a lot longer. And of course, they had more hygiene and cleanliness. They were living in conditions that were much better. And so they lived a lot longer. But for your common people during this time period, life expectancy was low. Now, with the Renaissance comes a rebirth in education, where we're now placing an emphasis on learning to read, and there's dollars in it because printing presses are being developed and people are printing books, and you need people to be able to read to sell those books to make money. And we started educating people, and as they became educated, as we kind of got out of these dark ages into an age of what we call enlightenment, where people were getting educated and they were reading, and uh, they were able to draw conclusions for themselves. They had time to actually think about things and draw their own conclusions. What happened was some of what was being discovered by scientists at the time, um, think about like Galileo and Copernicus and the heliocentric theory versus the ethnocentric theory, right? So what scientists started to discover is that they had empirical evidence that there were things going on that were different from how religion was telling them it was happening. And so we have the start of our science in conflict with Western religion, mostly Christianity, if we're talking about Europe here. So you have a movement forward here where one group is saying, well, we have evidence of this. And then the church was saying, well, this is how we teach it, and this is how it's always been. And in some cases, providing evidence for what they thought. A lot of that was, of course, biblical text. And so it was like, well, we have this right here in writing from this person in this age. And then the scientists would say, well, we have this over here, and here's the proof for that. And as people became more educated, they began to move more towards the science side. And religion had a decision to make, Christianity in particular, and it was, are we going to continue to fight against the evidence and try and stop people from discovering new evidence? Or are we going to start mixing religion with science? Is there a way that it could kind of mix together? And think about creation for a minute. If you go to creation, there's the hard line. The world is 6,000 years old, and that's it. And everything else that exists out there is just um, fake or made up. When somebody talks about creation and you say, well, what about dinosaur bones? The answer is, well, God planted those dinosaur bones to um, to challenge the faithful and to see if they really would remain faithful, even with this apparent evidence. So that's where you get the really hard line creationists. But then you get all sorts of different levels of creationism where people say, well, maybe the Earth is a lot older. Maybe it's not 6,000 years old. Maybe the way that we understood time back then in the early days of the Bible is different than it is now. And because Moses allegedly lived, and I can't remember the number because all these different prophets lived for very long times, but I think Moses was like 900 years old. I'd have to look it up, so don't take me at my word there. But he lived a long time compared to what the life expectancy would be then or now. And so those are the kind of things where you look at it and you go, well, maybe it's possible that their understanding of time was different than ours, and or ours is today. And so maybe it isn't 6,000 years. Maybe based on their understanding of time, we are a lot older. And that would account for a lot of what we know is older than 6,000 years. And then there's other versions of creationism. You can go all the way to the point where you say, why can't the Big Bang and creationism both exist? Why couldn't God have created the Big Bang? Remember, this goes back to the first cause. If you remember Thomas Aquinas from our philosophy chapter, first cause, right? Why? I mean, everything had to come from something. You don't get something from nothing. That's some science for you, right? And if there's nothing, and then all of a sudden there's something, there has to be a creator. So maybe it isn't exactly as the Bible says, where it happens in 7 days, and certain things are created on certain days, and so on and so forth. But it's logical, reasonable to think that an entity, a spiritual power, created everything. And why can't we have a coexistence between the Big Bang and creation theory? And there are people out there that believe that. So I guess what I'm saying, based on this last PowerPoint or last bullet point, sorry, what I'm saying here is that there's a, a, a change in education, and people are starting to understand reason and science and scientific method, and that comes into direct conflict with the church. And the church for the next 500 years up until right now has gone in different directions at different eras and different time periods, but it's become somewhat flexible or adaptable, more so than it was 500 years ago. But in that time, it might not have moved fast enough for some people. And that's where you get secularism on the rise since the European Renaissance, and certainly the last 100 years. We did this in class. You guys did your pre-quiz, and you guys, in my 10 years of teaching human geography, this year there was more students that identified as secular in some way than I've ever seen in the last 10 years. And I always say this every year. I say, think about how many people would have identified as secular 20 years ago, and 50 years ago, and then 100 years ago, right? I would argue that probably 95 to 98% of the class would have identified as religious 100 years ago, maybe more. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it was 100% of the class identified as religious 100 years ago. Now, over 50% of you identified as secular, at least in sixth period. 50% of you or more identified as secular. If I remember correctly, it was actually 2/3 of the class identified in some sort of secular religious observance. So when I say it's on the rise, I mean this is statistically true, not just in the United States, but around the world, particularly in countries that are first world or countries that are highly educated and industrialized. Okay, so let's talk. I did three leaders. There's more. We could talk a lot about this, but I did three leaders of the religious revolution. These are people that kind of began secularism, we'll say, or were famous for being secular. And then we're going to do three forms of secularism. So I figure there's a lot of different people involved in this, and there's a lot of different forms of secularism. But I did the three most well known for our purposes here. Okay, so the first one is Darwin, and of course, Darwin is kind of the lightning rod for the contemporary debate on evolution versus creation. Everybody knows the story of Darwin. He studied animals. He was a scientist. What's interesting is he was religious. He was not atheist. He was not a non-religious person. His book is right there on the screen for you. Origin of Species. When he wrote this book, and again, he is not anti-religion. When he wrote the book, there is nothing in it that says anything about religion. The book is purely, this is what I discovered. This is what my research is showing me. He came up with the idea of survival of the fittest, which is so important to understand correctly. Fittest does not mean strongest. It does not mean most intelligent. Fittest means the what's the right word? The adaptability. It means your ability to adapt to your surroundings. Some of it is just natural, like you don't have any control over it, and others is you being able to shift and move and adapt to your environment. So that would be fittest. And the finches on Galapagos Islands are the perfect example. And this is one of the things that we're going to do for those of you traveling to the Galapagos with us. We are supposed to go next summer, so about a year from right now, June of 2021. We are supposed to go to Galapagos, but I believe that's going to be pushed back to 2022, and we're going to Costa Rica instead. We were supposed to go to Costa Rica next month, but with everything going on, we pushed each one back a year. So we were going to go to the Galapagos and go to Darwin's center there and learn more about what he did. But he essentially traveled from um, Great Britain over to the Galapagos Islands. He there studied a number of different animal species. One of them was a finch, and what he realized was the main food source for these finches was a nut, and to get to it, you had to crack the shell. And based on the size of the beak of the finch, which is a smaller bird, uh, based on the size of the beak, they could get the right amount of leverage to crack the shell and get to the food source. And if the beak wasn't quite the right size, it was harder to get through the shell. So what happens? Well, the finch with the right size beak to get to the food source, they are going to eat more, which means they're going to be healthier and stronger, which means they're going to procreate more. And then more finches with the correct size beak for the food source are going to be born on the island. Meanwhile, if you don't have the correct size beak, you don't eat as well, you don't get as much food, you're not as healthy, you don't procreate as much, you die off sooner or quicker. And eventually, over time, you see that the majority of the finches on the island have a certain sized beak, one that is, fits the food source. And again, it has nothing to do with strength or intelligence. It's just luck in this case. If you end up having what you need to survive in this particular environment, you survive. And if you don't, you don't. That's the theory of survival of the fittest. And that's where he comes up with evolution. Evolution today has become its own classification or its own study. We call it biology. So, biology class is essentially studying evolution, and so it is a proven thing, right? Every student across the United States learns about biology, and rightfully so. It's important information to kind of have as you go out into the world. That level of intelligence is important. So, there's kind of Darwin and what he did. Again, he never meant to challenge religion. He himself was a religious person. He had even considered entering into a religious endeavor as a younger guy. And so he, in his book, doesn't say anything. He's used as this example of all that is wrong with atheism, and it really doesn't make sense. He's not atheist, and he at no point ever claims to be atheist or non-religious or secular. Now, I said he didn't write anything about religion in his book. Actually, on the very last page of Origin of Species, as he's kind of closing everything out in his research, there's one line in there, and I'm paraphrasing because I can't remember exactly what it says, but it's one line where it essentially says, "I know, or I'm not ignorant to the fact that this is going to come into conflict with some religious teachings." So essentially, what he does in the end is he acknowledges that people are going to take this work and that it's going to cause issues between religions, where or religion and science. So he was not ignorant of the impact of his research, but he in no way is trying to downplay the importance of religion in society or turn people to atheism or anything along those lines. It's more of, I'm a scientist, here's my research, this is what I know based on what I've seen. I know that it's not going to go over well in religious circles, but this is what I found. So there's your Origin of Species and Darwin, and a little bit about Galapagos and finches and things like that. Okay. Next one is Karl Marx. Marx wrote a book called The Communist Manifesto, and Marx is openly atheist. So he is not like Darwin, where he's saying, "Hey, I'm just doing some research here, and this is what I found. Take it and do what you will with it." What Marx is saying is very specific. And what's interesting is he's not focusing on religion here. What he's focusing on is politicians and political systems, right? Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto lays out the ideas of communism. In it, he discusses religion, but the book is not written. The Communist Manifesto is not about atheism or not about religion. It's about, creating a government that is good for the people. Now, that's in theory, of course. I'm not saying that it's good for the people. I think the ways that in which countries have tried communism have proved that communism is not good for the people. But that government that he tried to create was one that he thought would be good for the people. So he was not ill-intentioned. I actually believe that Marx was well-intentioned. It just his idea didn't work. I think we can all think of a time in our life where we were well-intentioned, but it didn't go well. And I think that's, for me at least, that's how I would sum up Karl Marx and the Communist Manifesto. Well-intentioned, but it didn't go well. Now, as far as the religious piece of this, right? He said that religion is the opiate of the masses. And he said what happens is the people in power use religion to get the commoners, the average everyday people, to do whatever it is that they want. So when they say it's the opiate of the masses, what he's saying is, somebody feeds you drugs. You don't just make them or grow them yourselves, usually. Usually, an opiate or opium is going to be produced and given to you. And once you start to use it, you're hooked, and the people in power control you because you're stuck on this drug, and you're not yourself anymore, right? So that's the idea that he's working off of here, is that economic and political powers use religion to distract people from what's really going on or inflame people to get them to do what they want to do. He essentially says if people didn't cling to their religion, and I'm using his words here, not mine, if people didn't cling to their religion, there'd be less fighting, less death, less destruction. The world would be a happier place, and the masses would have more power because they would eliminate one of those things that the power structure uses to keep you down. So if you really want to have power, think back to like existentialism. This is kind of an existentialist argument here too, right? So if you want to be a free thinker, if you want to be somebody who does things on your own. Religion is like herd mentality. If you believe in a religion, then you must believe these things in this religion, and that allows the people in power to control your actions. And so the idea here is, if you really want to be yourself, then you can't be tied to this religion that dictates what you think and what you do. So that was Karl Marx. Again, not he is definitely questioning religion, but that wasn't his main goal. His main goal here was to create a political system that was for the people and by the people. And he felt like one of the ways to do that was to disconnect people from their religion. And you guys know, because we've talked about it many times in class here, because we've looked a lot at China this year and Russia to an extent too, and North Korea. But you guys can see what happens when communism actually does take hold and forced secularism comes into place. It becomes a dictatorship. It's not a for the people, by the people, as Marx wanted it to be. So I will say this, you've probably heard this before too, and this is historically accurate. Nobody has actually created a communist government that matches what Karl Marx wrote in the Communist Manifesto. The power has not been given to the people in any of these communist governments. The power has been given to a small select few who manipulate that power. Probably worse than it was manipulated before we had communism. So communism has gone down a road of totalitarian dictatorships, which is not how Karl Marx saw this happening. But when you create a government like that, it kind of creates a vacuum, and somebody's going to come along and sweep up all that power, and that's what happens in communism. So I don't know that communism can exist the way that Karl Marx wrote it up. Remember, this is just an idea, and it was tried by a number of countries, and it didn't work in any of those countries. So I don't know that it can work the way that he wanted it to, because people tried to make it work the way he wanted it to, and this is what we ended up with, the communist regimes that you all know about. So anyway, there is Karl Marx and his thoughts on religion, even though he was not some kind of religious philosopher. That was more of a byproduct of what he was doing. Okay, and for secularism, just to give you an idea, I think it's a pretty interesting study, because we had a lot of communist regimes that, going back to 1919 with the Soviets communist revolution, and you have communism then spreading to a number of other countries over the next 50 years. That is all essentially gone today. You do have dictatorships in place in a lot of these areas. And China still calls itself communist, but economically, it's really not. They're as much a free market economy as we are. They have as much private ownership as the United States does. They're really not a communist economy anymore. They're still a communist government, but I would argue that that's not really a communist government. It's just a dictatorship that's calling itself communist. Because communism is an economic principle more than anything else, and they're no longer economically communist. So they're really just a dictatorship that calls themselves communist. And when this happened, right, one of the things that communism did is it eliminated religion, because it gave the power and the control to all the power and control to the political leader. When you have religion, people can go, well, I disagree with my political leader based on my religious principles, and it's hard to argue against that. But if there's no religious principles, if there's no religion, then your political leader is the end all be all. And so what happened with these dictatorships is they became atheist. Forced secularism, we'll say, or forced atheism. And that means that the dictator is the religious leader too, or the moral authority might be a better way to say it. And so this happened in China. We talked a little bit about that as we talked about Confucianism and Taoism. And of course, it happened in the Soviet Union. And here's what's interesting about that study. Here's a part of the old Soviet Union, as you can see here. And if you look at the smaller bullets, remember, the Soviet Union had an official policy of atheism. They discouraged religious practice. They actually destroyed churches and mosques and synagogues and anything that they could find that was a symbol of religion. So there was a real concerted effort to root out all religion. And this goes back to the 1920s, and it existed all the way through the 1990s. And then in 1991, the Communist Party comes to an end, and you get a version of democracy in the Soviet Union. I'm sorry, in Russia, and the Soviet Union breaks apart, and all the smaller countries that were part of the Soviet Union, they all get control again. And Armenia, as you see on the map there, and Azerbaijan, as you see on the map there, they both were part of the old Soviet Union. And you would think that after 3 generations of forced atheism, that religion would all be gone, all but be gone from the people. And that is not true. Actually, as soon as that religious oppression was lifted and religion was allowed again, you suddenly had religion thriving in these areas, which means people were religious underground. And oftentimes that's what happens. So that's the kind of the moral of the slide here with forced secularism. You cannot force people out of religion. What it means is they'll probably become stronger. It's almost like when you have religious freedom, you become a little less religious. And when you're oppressed or you don't have religious freedom, you grab onto it and you hold on to it a little bit stronger. And I find that really interesting. That tends to be true all over. So anyway, there's your kind of lesson on forced secularism there. And of course, one of the issues that we have here is that you have Muslim and Christian factions living in these countries, and this is again the power vacuum I was talking about. So if you have the Soviet Union in these countries saying there's no religion whatsoever, that makes it pretty simple, and there's no fighting because you're not allowed to be religious. But once that is lifted and everybody says, okay, you can have your religious freedom, well, now you're going to have people battling for power and battling for control. And that's where you get religious conflict. In this case, between Muslims and Christians who are trying to gain control of the country and then, of course, rule that country from a particular moral perspective. Okay. And the last of our, we'll say, religious revolution leaders, and that would be Sigmund Freud. Most of you know him. You've probably learned about him in some class somewhere before. I don't really talk about him. He doesn't come into American history at all, but sometimes in English class, certainly if you took psychology, you would have learned about him or you will learn about him. So Sigmund Freud is a scientist, a psychiatrist, a philosopher. He kind of he's involved in a lot of different endeavors. So he wrote a book. This is about 100 years ago now. He wrote it in the 19 teens, if I remember correctly. It's actually a pretty small book. It's like 100 pages or maybe a little bit more, 120 pages. It's called The Future of an Illusion. And in it, he kind of states his case. Now, Freud is somebody who is directly writing a book about religion. You got to remember, Darwin's book was a book on science and biology and evolution that is used by some in the debate against religion. And Marx is writing a book about economics and political leadership that mentions religion, but he's not writing about religion. Freud is writing about religion. The whole book, everything in the Future of Illusion, is all about religion. And I'll kind of sum up the book for you. I actually read it for a class for comparative religious thought, actually. I took a comparative religious thought class when I was working on my undergrad, and I had to read Sigmund Freud's book as the kind of secular part of the course. And it was a quick read, and I'll kind of summarize it for you here real quick. He basically says it's time for the human race to grow up and quit believing in illusions, as he called them, or make believe. At some point, it's time to follow reason and evidence. And how long are we going to believe in these make believe childhood type belief systems? And he said that religion was important. So early in his book, he does say, hey, religion was important. It was very important. It made a difficult existence more bearable. Think back to when you could control the crops, control the rain, uh, ask for a good hunt and food supplies by worshiping the gods, right? And think about early humans and morality and how barbaric people were and how they would treat each other. And religion helped calm people and bring a sense of morality to our lives. So religion, he says early on, religion has done a lot for the human race. And it was really, really important to have these religious understandings as the human race was growing up. But he said, the human race has now reached a point where they don't need to believe in these things anymore. You can live a life that is morally correct, and you can use reason and science to understand the world and grow crops and things like that. And he basically says there's just no need for this anymore. And the way that religion is operating now is more negative than positive. So he actually goes on to say that religion is a detriment to society. People are doing things that are wrong in the name of religion, and it's causing more trouble than it's doing uh, good. So there's his approach. And again, he is straightforward, laying the foundation for atheism. And that's his goal. So his goal is not anything but questioning religion and trying to get people to wake up to what he believes is the truth about spirituality and religion. So, and you can see a quote there from him. I did that where I look for specific quotes from these people. So if you even go back in the video or go to the slides online, you'll see quotes from Darwin and other people. So I've tried specifically to take the people that have said these things and give them a quote there. All right. So there is your leaders of the religious revolution. Now let's get into voluntary secularism today. Now, we already talked about forced secularism. That is if you grow up in a country where you're not allowed to have religion. Just think about like Stalin's Russia or something like that, right? So there's your involuntary secularism or forced secularism, we call it. Voluntary secularism is people who just decide for themselves that they are going to be non-religious, as the visual there represents. And this is where I hope that I can help identify for those of you that said, "Hey, I'm kind of non-religious, but I don't really know what I think, or I don't know how to organize what I think." Hopefully, the next couple of slides here help you with that. Okay, so essentially, if you are a voluntary secularist, then you do not care to think about or consider religion. You just live a life where religious tradition does not play a major role. And it means that you could still involve yourself in things. I know people in my life where we have conversations and they're like, yeah, I go to church once a month, or I go every week, or I go twice a year. But I go because, I want my kids to have some understanding of religion, or I go because it makes my parents happy, or something along those lines. I really don't believe in it. So you hear a lot of that where it's like, well, yeah, I'm Christian. I go to church once in a while, but I'm really not religious. I don't believe in a lot of what I see or hear. That would still qualify as voluntary secularism. If you're doing something out of obligation and you don't actually believe it, then you would be considered a secular person. So let's put it that way. And again, I'm going to try and help define what that means for you. Probably the most popular form of secularism today is agnostics or agnosticism. This is a guy by the name of Thomas Huxley that came up with it. What he essentially said was, I don't know. Think about this. How can I know for sure? How can I say, yes, I believe in something that I can't prove? And of course, if you're faithful, you say, I feel it in my heart, and that's enough proof for me. And again, we're going to go back to relativism here and say what's true for you is true for you. And in no way are we saying that anybody listening to this should not believe what they believe. That's the great part about living in a free country is your beliefs are your beliefs, and whatever that is, if you're not causing harm to others, then there's no reason why you shouldn't believe in what you want to believe and live your life the way you want to live your life. And that's I think something that we can easily apply across the board to everything we've talked about today, and really everything we've talked about in so back to agnosticism. What he essentially says is, um, I can't know for sure. Maybe there's a God, maybe there isn't. Without being able to prove it, though, I can't say one way or another. And in my life, it really doesn't matter. It it's um, important that you live for the people around you. It's important that you take care of yourself. This in no way is to be confused with Satanism. I think for a lot of people early on, as humanism and agnosticism and atheism was developing, people would quickly point the finger and go, "Well, you're a devil worshiper." No, that's not what we're saying here. What an agnostic is saying is believe in your own version of a higher power, live whatever life of spirituality you want. This almost goes to William James and personalized religion, right? Whatever individual spirituality you have, that's fine. It's up to you what you believe. And so an agnostic could have some form of individualized spirituality. A lot of times agnostics will take and combine traditions. For example, karma. A lot of agnostics would say, yeah, I kind of believe what goes around comes around. That's a Hindu Buddhist principle. But they might also believe a Christian principle. So their spirituality, living in this world we do now of mass information and understandings of all sorts of different traditions that people didn't really know about on a regular basis, or that most people growing up would never have heard or been exposed to something like a Hinduism or Buddhism. Now that we are, because we live in this highly globalized world, now we understand things differently. We start to combine some of these different religious traditions. Think back to what we talked about with diffusion and religious diffusion, right? Spread of ideas and religious ideas. A lot of people are agnostic because they believe in a multitude of different ideas from different religions. And so they have their own version, and that would be agnostic. So, believe it or not, you could take agnostic and you could break it down into 10 different levels. From the person that says, I believe in traditions from 5 different religions, to somebody that says, yeah, I don't really know and I don't care. Whatever. Maybe there's a God, maybe there isn't, right? So you could then, and they're actually defined, by the way. So there's this version of agnosticism and this version of and we're not going to get into all that today, as we've done with all the other religions. We didn't get into all of the separate pieces. So we're not going to break agnosticism down today. But just so you know, it's kind of this all-encompassing. Um, I understand religion. I am not atheist, right? That's the big thing to remember here. Agnosticism is not atheism. If you're agnostic, you leave room open for a higher power, or maybe you even believe in a higher power that doesn't match any other religion's higher power. But you don't live a life based on religious principle. That's kind of the idea there, is that you don't have this like daily or weekly religious adherence that you subscribe to. Okay, so there's agnosticism for you, and I gave you another quote from Thomas Huxley to kind of give you like his version of what agnosticism was. Okay, next up we have humanism. Humanism, again, I want to say right away, humanism is not atheism and it's not Satanism. So humanism is basically saying that you believe in the power and the future of the human race. So think humanist, human race, human, right? The idea here is that you are trying to improve life and society for everybody. Almost as I teach this course, this is something that I just came to my own conclusion on. So of course, feel free to disagree with me. And like I said, guys, I always say, I don't know anything. You should be, if you're really interested in this, researching more of this for yourself, right? I am self-taught on all of these things. I've taken classes, I've read books, same as anybody else, right? But I am in no way some kind of expert on all of this. I'm sharing the knowledge that I have from the sources that I get them from, and feel free to go and research all of this on your own and come to your own understanding of it. Don't take my understanding of it. Come to your own conclusions. So for humanism, they believe generally that um, focusing on one another, focusing on society, focusing on the people around you will make the world a better place. So what's really important in life is loving and caring for each other and creating a better world for everybody, not focusing on the spiritual world. So, like I was about to say a couple minutes ago, it's like Confucianism. Remember, Confucius said, "Beware of people who claim to know what the gods want, for they often manipulate." He said that dedication to the living is more important than dedication to the spiritual world. So, humanism is kind of a modern day Confucianism, where you're saying it's about creating a better place. And those that claim to believe and know God, they can cause pain and suffering in the world. A non-religious existence, not an atheist, but a non-religious existence is better for everybody. Now, a lot of people originally pointed the finger at humanists and said, "Well, you guys must be criminals and amoral people, things like that." And it's the exact opposite, actually. I would argue that humanists are totally preoccupied with equality, fairness, justice, reason, ethics, and morals. You could make an argument that people that are humanists may have more of a focus on those things than somebody who isn't humanist. It's almost like they're trying to make the world a better place. So they're trying to make sure that they have, um, we would say, like a constitution and bill of rights for everybody. Like everybody should have their natural rights protected. So in a lot of ways, a humanist is actually somebody who is more, um, more bill of rights oriented, protecting individual rights and making the world a better place than somebody who is religious. So and I only say that because people that are religious are focused on other things. It's not a main focus in religion, in Christianity, let's say, to make sure that there's justice or that the human race is better, right? It's very much focused on a spiritual world. Humanists don't have that focus on a spiritual world, so they're just focused on the human race. Again, they don't deny the existence of gods. They believe in the otherworldly. They can be agnostic, and there is such a thing as an agnostic humanist, somebody that kind of believes in a certain version of spirituality that is their own. But at the same time, their real focus is on the human race. And humanism is a response to the perceived immoralities of religion. And we talked way back when about the good that religion does and the bad that religion does. The truth is that it's very yin and yang. There's opposites in religion, and religion has been responsible for some really horrible things. In the name of religion, people do really horrible things, including murder and uh, like the worst of the worst. But more generally, we could say that people are homophobic because of religious understandings. You've got pedophilia as part of an issue within religion. The Catholic Church has been dealing with that for decades now, and this pope in particular was actually elected, as we talked about before, to deal with this problem within the church. You've got white supremacy. You guys all know that the KKK is a Christian religious organization. Male dominance, class inequality, imperial arrogance. These are all things that are tied to religion today. And not to any one religious person. So I'm certainly not trying to point the finger at any one person and say this person is this. But there are groups out there that take this approach to things. And we've all heard the speech from a homophobic um, pastor or priest that just doesn't seem to fit with a younger population today. What I see that is somewhat promising for me is I see a younger generation that's just more accepting than my generation was. People are different. They come from different places. They have different ways of seeing and understanding things. And if you're outside of what would be considered the norm of society, you're accepted into society today much more so than you were 20 years ago and 50 years ago and 100 years ago. And some of that has to do with this humanist thinking, whether you would call yourself a humanist or not. Being concerned with justice, reason, ethics, and morals makes you, to a degree, a humanist, even if you have a religious affiliation. And this kind of rise in humanism has created what humanists would say is a better world. So there is humanism, and oh, sorry, I forgot the 10 non-commandments from humanists. So here are the 10 non-commandments to be compared to your 10 commandments and maybe your 5 pillars too. So, commandment number 1, be open minded and be willing to alter your beliefs with new evidence. Number 2, strive to understand what is most likely to be true, not to believe what you wish to be true. Number 3, the scientific method is the most reliable way of understanding the natural world. So you can see the kind of justice, morality coming into play here, and the kind of free thinking. Certainly, those with a higher education can identify with some of this. Number 4, every person has the right to control their own body. Number 5, God is not necessary to be a good person or to live a full and meaningful life. Number 6, be mindful of the consequences of your actions and recognize that you must take responsibility for them. Number 7, treat others as you would want them to treat you and can reasonably expect them to want to be treated. And that's an interesting one. That's the golden rule, kind of rewritten. And the golden rule does appear in most religious traditions. What I like about what humanists do here is they add that last part, can reasonably expect them to want to be treated. Because a lot of times, how you want to be treated is not how somebody else wants to be treated. And you can't assume that just because I want to be treated this way, so does everybody else. So to just say treat others as you want to be treated, that may not go over so well in some scenarios. So the idea is think about the person and treat them in a way that you think they would want to be treated. So now the focus is off of you and it's on to the other person. And that's the whole idea of humanism, right? Is to try and create a better world for everybody. So the adaptation that they take to the golden rule with number 7, I think is pretty interesting. We have the responsibility to consider others, including future generations. So, and you guys know me well enough to know that regardless of whether I'm a humanist or not, and of course I never give my religious affiliations, but you guys know that I like generally what it says in number 8 right there, right? You have to consider other people. That's the whole point in human geography is studying other people, and considering future generations. As you heard me talk during the population and environment chapter, it's really important to think about the future of the human race and the future of the planet and what kind of world do we want for our kids and our grandkids, because it comes faster than you think. And we want to, each generation has a reputation, and you want your generation to have a reputation that you did the right thing for the future of the human race. The last 2, you got number 9. There is no one right way to live, and again, that's kind of giving that freedom. I think that goes very well with somebody who would be an independent thinker, or if you think politically, that's somebody who is doesn't really fit with the Democrat or Republican Party and calls themselves libertarian, right? There's no one right way to live. Nobody can tell me how to live. As long as I'm not doing harm to others, let me live my life. So you can kind of see humanism and libertarianism oftentimes have a connection between the two. And you're finding more and more people that consider themselves libertarian who are humanist to a degree. And the last one, leave the world a better place than you found it. Again, that kind of goes to the environment and the planet. Okay, so there's your humanist 10 non-commandments, or their own 10 commandments. And last thing we're going to talk about today, we've talked about it a bunch, so I'm going to be real quick here. Atheists do not believe in any gods or any religions. The important thing to remember here is that this is faith. So you really don't see a lot of faith in agnostics or humanists. They're really using what we would say is scientific evidence or scientific method to try to come to conclusions on things, and they're on reason, believing in reason and science and stuff like that. In this case, if you're an atheist, you believe that there is no God and there's no evidence. that there is no God. You can't prove that there's no God. So this is a leap of faith, and this is a faith-based understanding of things. What's different, and I say on here again that it's oftentimes confused with Satanism. It's not. Atheists are oftentimes considered immoral people or criminals. That is also not true. Oftentimes they're scientists. They're highly educated. They live very moral, respectful lives. So atheists. This is something that I said way back when too, and I'll say it again here. Being religious or being non-religious doesn't make you a good person. Your actions do, not your beliefs. And I've known people in my life that are very, very religious, and they are not uh, moral or good people. And I've known people in my life that are very, very religious, and they are wonderful people, as great as you could imagine. And the opposite is true, right? Where I've known people in my life that are atheists, that are terrible people, and I make that determination based on their decision making and the actions that I've seen them take. And I've known people in my life that are atheists that are wonderful people. And so religion does not define who you are, your actions do. And so you can't just automatically say, well, you believe this, therefore you must be this. It just doesn't work that way. So I wouldn't say that just because you're uh, very, very religious, that you're a certain something, or that you're not religious, or you're a certain something. And I would say that this is very true of atheism. Atheists. Atheists will say that they are grounded in reality and common sense, that it just kind of going back to like a Freud. Freud was kind of like the first atheist, where he said, this is crazy to believe this any longer. How long are we going to believe in all these make believe ideas, right? I mean, we grow out a lot of them as we grow out of childhood. When is it time to grow out of the religion? Make believe, and that's the grounded in reality and common sense piece. Um, and again, they're faithful. They're faithful that they're right. The big difference here, of course, is they're not meeting anywhere. They're not. There's no book of atheism. There's no congregation, no churches, no meetings, anything like that. It's just a belief. It's just what you think. So that's why it's kind of deemed to be, a secular, non-religious thing, even though it's still faith. So by the definition of believing in something without evidence, atheism is a religion. It's a faith, but it doesn't come with any of the other things, the traditions that you get with other faiths. And so we don't really look at it that way. Okay, so there is atheism for you. And here is your class activity. This is the last activity for the quarter. So last graded assignment for the quarter. And we'll have one more PowerPoint Screencastify, and then you'll have a test on Friday. So here's what I'd like you to do. And of course, you can do it in your groups of 2 to 4. Again, put everybody's name on it. So I've been receiving documents from people, and it only has one name on it. And then people come back later and say, oh, yeah, I worked on this. So make sure that everybody's name goes on it right away, so it doesn't appear suspicious to me that suddenly somebody's name is on it that wasn't originally on it. So please make sure that you're doing that from the start, and please work on this together. Don't have somebody do it and you not be a part of it. So be a good person and help your group out by contributing to the assignment. All right, so names on it, and you can do a bullet pointed list here. That's fine. This doesn't have to be in paragraph form or with thesis statements or anything like that. It's more about finding the information than the mode of how you deliver it. I want you to pick a person associated with secularism. We went through a bunch of them. So it can be anybody associated with secularism from the PowerPoint. And I want you to research them a little bit further. You don't have to answer all of these questions, but make sure that you are complete. You have to answer some of the questions and make sure that you're giving good, complete answers. So anybody that sounded interesting to you that you want to do more research on, go spend a couple of minutes, look them up, and generally think about what else led to this line of thinking. So what influences were in their life? Why did this person come to think this way? So what event may have caused this? So the first one is about like background and childhood, or area of the world they lived in, stuff like that. And then the next one is, was there an event? Was there something specific that may have caused them to go down this road? The third one, when did it start and how was it developed? So like what year, when was the book written? How is it developed over time? How did it spread? Who picked up on the idea and took it in a new direction? Stuff like that. What stereotypes are associated with that particular line of thinking and with the person that came up with it today? So think about how that person is perceived today. And then what famous, influential people today agree with this line of thinking? So who's a popular humanist today or something along those lines? So see who else in the world today may agree with this person or be known for that. Okay? So please have that turned in to me by Wednesday morning, 8 o'clock. And watch the last of the PowerPoint series that's going to come out probably in the next 24 hours. And then, of course, get ready for your test by using the study guide on the website. Okay, everybody, enjoy the rest of your day. Make sure that assignment's turned in by Wednesday. And we will see you guys in a Zoom session soon. Thanks, everybody.